As North Korea prepares reportedly a new missile that one Russian lawmaker claims could hit the west coast of our country, President Trump is not backing down in his cryptic reminders of what Kim Jong Un's regime could face if it does indeed threaten us. Yesterday, he tweeted this, quote, "Presidents and their administrations have been talking to North Korea for 25 years. Agreements made and massive amounts of money paid. Hasn't worked. Agreements violated before the ink was dry, making fools of U.S. negotiators. Sorry, but only one thing will work." For more that one thing, we're joined by Ambassador John Bolton, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a Fox News contributor, and chairman of the Gatestone Institute here in New York. Ambassador, the term "only one thing," is this type of language bellicose and dangerous and irresponsible, as critics claim, or is it a potent reminder of what Kim Jong Un could face?
Well, I don't think the language really has any effect on the calculations. I mean, people know the president tweets, and it's a way to hear from him unmediated by the press. But the fact is, his central point is that three prior administrations over a 25-year period have tried the State Department's favorite approach, a mixture of carrots and sticks, incentives and disincentives, to try and stop the North Koreans, and it's failed for 25 years. Susan Rice, Barack Obama's national security advisor, admitted this a few weeks ago in an op-ed in the New York Times. So I think the key point is, don't think that talking to North Korea at this point is going to have any impact is real. Now, there are other options out there. Which one the president was referring to, I don't know. I think there's at least one Freudian slip, one diplomatic option left. We've talked about before, negotiating with China to reunite the Korean Peninsula. Maybe that's what he was referring to.
Or do you think there's really any possibility of that? I mean, he won't even, Kim Jong Un won't even let the Chinese envoy that Beijing has established for his country into North Korea.
Yeah. Look, the Chinese, I think, certainly younger Chinese leaders increasingly appreciate that carrying around this ugly piece of baggage called North Korea doesn't benefit China, that the existence of the North Korean regime is not an effective buffer against the United States, and that its continuing nuclear weapons program poses risks for China. For example, if Japan says, we're not going to depend on the U.S. nuclear umbrella, we're going to get our own nuclear capability, that's a direct threat to China. So there's a way here to talk to the Chinese. I think there's a deal. I could describe the parameters of it again. But the point is, if you want to try a diplomatic option, don't waste your time talking to the Kim family dictatorship. Talk to the people in Beijing.
And what type of deal specifically do you recommend?
Well, I think reunification can come in the following way. The Chinese fear a couple things if North Korea were to collapse, for example, after a U.S. military strike against the nuclear program. The first thing they fear, massive flows of North Korean refugees. We can deal with that because if the regime collapsed, the South Koreans would fear their own flow of North Korean refugees. So there's a constructive way to deal with that. And the other thing the Chinese don't want more than anything else is American troops on their border with Korea, the Yalu River and the Tumen River. And honestly, we don't want to be along those rivers any more than we want to be deployed today along the demilitarized zone. We want American forces in Korea at the tip of the peninsula so they're rapidly deployable elsewhere in Asia. There's a deal there with China. It's not an easy negotiation. I wish we'd started long ago. But for those who think that the military option is unimaginable, this is the most likely diplomatic solution. So people can dismiss it if they want, but it only constrains what is available, which is increasingly looking at military force to use against the North's program.
Well, I mean, of course, if there is military force, there are the predictions of mass, overwhelming casualties. They're beyond comprehension.
Well, nobody wants to use military force, but here's the question that the President of the United States has to answer. Are we prepared to live forever with North Korea having nuclear weapons? Will Americans be under that threat as far as the eye can see? I find that unacceptable. I think there are substantial things that could be done to mitigate the effect on South Korea. We should bend every effort to that effect. But fundamentally, the President's responsible for protecting Americans.
And finally, in terms of protecting Americans, there are this Russian lawmaker saying that they're about to test a new long-range missile that he says they showed the calculations could reach the U.S. mainland on the West Coast. This could come on Tuesday because it's the anniversary of the Workers' Party's founding. So what do we do if indeed they do launch this missile? Not this far, but potentially this far, and it shows that they do have the capability of hitting us.
Yeah. Well, I think most analysts have believed for some time that North Korea did have a missile capable of hitting some part of the United States, perhaps even further than just the West Coast. Very interesting. They showed these calculations to Russians, since many fear that Russian ballistic missile experts have been helping with their program over the years in any case. And I think this is the kind of propaganda that North Korea has used effectively in the past to back America away from taking a strong position. They succeeded. I mentioned Susan Rice a moment ago. She's prepared to accept North Korea with nuclear weapons. I bet she and President Obama ultimately are willing to accept Iran with nuclear weapons. I'm not willing to accept either one.
Russia and Iran, besides apparently helping the North Koreans. So we shall see what happens on Tuesday, October 10th. Ambassador John Bolton, as always, thank you for your analysis.
Thank you, Eric.
Well, there's some conflicting messages from the Trump administration on North Korea today. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson saying there is open communication between us and Kim Jong Un's regime, saying there are 3 channels for direct discussions with North Korea, and that is raising the possibility of potential diplomatic talks with Pyongyang amid the recent heightened tensions. Tillerson's admission came after he met with Chinese leaders yesterday in Beijing. But within the last hour, President Trump offered a different prediction, and his tweeting about it is raising some eyebrows, saying, quote, told Rex Tillerson, our wonderful Secretary of State, that he is wasting his time trying to negotiate with little rocket man. Save your energy, Rex. We'll do what has to be done. Ambassador John Bolton is with us, former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Fox News contributor, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and chairman of the Gatestone Institute here in New York. Ambassador, is this good cop, bad cop, or did the president undercut his Secretary of State?
Well, it's never a good sign when you're getting your instructions in public, I suppose. But I think the president's absolutely right. It confounds me to think that the State Department is still trying to talk to North Korea. If that's what Secretary Tillerson meant, it is a complete waste of time. It's a waste of oxygen.
The Secretary of State said that they are, quote, he used the word probing. Probing. What are they probing for? What are they going to find?
Well, they're not going to find anything. Look, we've negotiated with North Korea about their nuclear program for 25 years, during which time the North Koreans have happily and repeatedly pledged to give up their nuclear weapons program, happily and repeatedly lying about it each time. You know, one of the interesting aspects of what the Secretary said was that it undercut Japanese Prime Minister Abe inside Japan. Abe wrote a very strong op-ed a week ago about why negotiating with North Korea was a waste of time. And so there are ramifications to these kinds of comments, which I guess the President doesn't think we are negotiating.
Well, I mean, how do we deal with this? Look, throughout the whole history, as you point out, 1994, the oil for food deal under President Clinton, that failed. They lied. President George W. Bush took them off the terrorist list. Every time we give them an olive branch, they come back with a baseball bat. Although the six-party talks did work, obviously, for some time with Pyongyang, their nuclear program, but then they pulled the plug on that, too.
Well, I don't think they worked. Actually, well, they worked for North Korea. They didn't work for us, because negotiations buy time, and in a nuclear proliferation context, time is not a neutral asset. Time is something that the proliferator desperately needs. So my prediction would be, if at any point North Korea suddenly announces they want to sit down to talks, it means they're this close to getting a deliverable nuclear weapons capability, and they want to make absolutely sure they get across the finish line while we're playing the sucker.
Well, is there any way then, if they get to that point, for us to stop that? They have said they will not negotiate their nuclear program at all. Short of, you know, a military action, what can we do?
Well, I think the President made it very clear in his speech to the UN General Assembly that denuclearization of North Korea is the only way forward. And that means they either peacefully give up their nuclear weapons, which is unlikely unless China steps up to the plate, which they still show no real signs of doing, or you have to resort to military force. Nobody wants the last alternative, but I think the president said what most Americans think. We also don't want to leave North Korea with nuclear weapons to blackmail us until infinity.
Well, they're doing that right now. So, I mean, what type of, would we give them concessions, such as suspending or delaying the military exercises with South Korea or withdrawing some of our 28,000 troops?
I wouldn't give the North Korean regime air to breathe. I think that regime's got to be brought down one way or another. Look, unless you want to go back to those happy days of duck and cover drills and being extorted, as you say, take U.S. troops out of South Korea, take U.S. troops out of Guam, take them out of Japan, and watching the North Korean regime profit by selling its nuclear and ballistic missile technology to other rogue states and terrorists, I think you cannot leave that kind of regime in place with that kind of weapon.
And finally, when you mention bringing the regime down, how can the international community do that? We've seen stronger sanctions by China and the banks that have kicked in. What realistic possibility is there? What strategy do you suggest?
Well, I don't think the international community means a thing here. I think this is about China primarily, which does have the power to bring the North Korean regime down. And my recommendation remains a joint Chinese-American commitment to end the division of the Korean Peninsula and reunite essentially under South Korea, thus eliminating both the North Korean regime and its nuclear weapons program. I think, personally, that's the last peaceful solution we have left.
Up to Beijing and us, Ambassador John Bolton, as always, thank you for your analysis.
Thank you, Eric.
Of course.
Joining me now, John Bolton, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a former ambassador to the United Nations, Fox News contributor, and Ambassador, thanks for being with us.
Glad to be with you.
This is a cabinet and national security team that appears divided. At least Nikki Haley, the UN ambassador, agrees with the campaign position of President Trump that the deal is a bad one and should be abrogated, forthwith. Mattis, Tillerson, obviously making it clear that they think it's still in the national interest. This is a bizarre, if you will, divide, and I don't think that it's readily understandable, certainly not to me, I don't believe to most people, as to why there would be that cleavage.
Well, even worse, Lou, according to the reports we've seen, they're going to recommend, Sarah Huckabee Sanders said, make a unified recommendation on what to do, and they're leaking assiduously what the decision is, I think, to box the president in to try and reduce his room to maneuver. And the solution they've proposed is utterly bizarre. Contrary to the rhetoric about getting out of the deal, that is not what they are suggesting. They're suggesting that he not certify under the separate Corker-Cardin legislation that the deal's in the best interest of the United States, but nonetheless stay in the deal. Now, that is utterly illogical. It's a one shoe on, one shoe off approach, but the adherence of the deal...
Very Washingtonian, wouldn't you say?
You got it. Yeah, it's swampy. The adherence of the deal in the bureaucracy, the people who helped negotiate it, are desperate to save it. And so they've come up with this bizarre, internally contradictory, illogical approach. Frankly, it's not presidential. It's unbecoming that it would be suggested to him. I hope the president rejects it. Look, we've got to be clear. The president has to assert moral and political autonomy. He needs to abrogate the deal, withdraw the United States from it. How can you say that the deal is not in the best interest of the United States and stay in the deal? How in God's name can you do that?
Worked for some time in the bureaucracy of Washington, D.C.
Precisely.
Or most especially within the State Department itself.
Take out your saber, Mr. President, cut the Gordian knot, get out of the deal.
Let's turn to North Korea. And this is the president just moments ago having dinner with his military advisors tonight. Here is the president on North Korea.
In North Korea, our goal is denuclearization. We cannot allow this dictatorship to threaten our nation or our allies with unimaginable loss of life. We will do what we must do to prevent that from happening, and it will be done if necessary, believe me.
Your reaction, Ambassador?
That's exactly right. That's exactly the right policy. It's what the president said in his speech to the UN General Assembly some days ago. And the meaning of that statement is he wants an end result where North Korea does not have a nuclear weapons capability. He rejects the Obama administration strategy articulated by his national security advisor, Susan Rice, who says we should live with a North Korea with nuclear weapons. I think that's a disastrous policy. The president's right to reject it. And by the way, he would be right to reject it in the case of Iran, too. You cannot leave these rogue regimes with these destructive weapons.
It's almost unthinkable to contemplate Iran, the largest state sponsor of radical Islamist terrorism in the world, with nuclear weapons. It doesn't take a genius to come up with a straight line to the catastrophe that would result.
Yeah, and, you know, by the way, as we've just discussed the Iran nuclear deal, Iranian scientists, military officers, technicians continue to cooperate with North Korea on its ballistic missile program. The purpose of both is to deliver nuclear weapons. Who's kidding whom here about what Iran is up to?
Tillerson, Mattis jumping the president and getting well forward of him and putting out his position to a senior that insisted that he give a yes or no answer. Are you disappointed in Tillerson, in Mattis, and the way in which they have handled the discussion on the Iranian deal?
I think the bureaucracy is dominating this deal. I don't know what the discussions have been with the president. Of course, I tried to see him. I haven't been able to. I've asked again today to see him. We'll see what happens. But honestly, you need to have a thorough discussion of nuclear proliferation and its effects. Because I'll tell you, Lou, if, as appears likely, North Korea and Iran both end up with deliverable nuclear weapons, proliferation will spread at an even more rapid rate than we've seen before. And the spread of these nuclear weapons around the world increases dramatically the risks. They'll fall into the hands of terrorist groups, and we're going to see one in the United States.
And we need to recognize as we wrap up here that three administrations, the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and the Obama administration, had absolutely horrid policies and results, and in effect deferred a decision that now rests with this president, and it is a burdensome and complex one to resolve.
Yeah, no, it's been three administrations of failure, and I hope Trump doesn't make it a fourth.
Ambassador John Bolton, thanks. Good to have you here.
Angela Merkel wins a fourth term as Chancellor of Germany. The anti-immigration party made a very strong showing. Come in, Mr. Ambassador. John Bolton, former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Seems to me, take the big picture for a second, it looks like there is no strong voice in Europe any longer. No real leadership.
Yeah, well, this has been described as a hollow victory for Chancellor Merkel, and I think that's right. The Christian Democratic vote fell by over 20%. This is the worst vote for the Christian Democrats since 1949. It isn't any better for the Socialists, the #2 party. They had their worst results since before World War II. And obviously the big news is the Alternative for Germany party, which gained something over 13%. I think this will transform the debate in the Bundestag. I think a lot of the issues Merkel was able to dodge in her previous term are now going to be hotly debated. And the Christian Democrats now face a problem. May not affect them for the next year or so, but this is clearly Merkel's last run for chancellor. So they have to come up with a succession plan, and it's far from clear what that's going to look like.
Why should we care? Why should we care about this election result in Germany?
Because I think it's part of a trend across Europe. The traditional parties are losing their dominance. I think voters are dissatisfied. I think another interesting result yesterday is the Free Democrats, sometimes called the liberals, really 19th century liberal, very pro-free market, got over 10%, more than doubling their vote from the last election. So I think this is a signal overall that German politics has shifted to the right, not dramatically. But as I say, as the Christian Democrats and the Christian Social Union in Bavaria face the future without Merkel, I think they will move to the right as well.
Over the weekend, the Air Force flew bombers and fighter jets in international waters, but very, very close to North Korea's coastline. First time we've done that in many, many years. What do you think is the next move for the United States, having done what we just did over the weekend?
Well, I think there'll be a pause here, is my guess, for about 3 weeks. I think the president wants to see what happens with Xi Jinping at his big Communist Party conference, where Xi is going to try and consolidate power. I think everybody doesn't want to be distracted by North Korea, at least in China. So my guess is not much. But I think we're coming to the point where the president's going to have to make a decision if he's prepared to show a willingness to use force against North Korea's nuclear program.
That would be shooting down one of their missiles. That would be a show of force. That would be the next move for us, wouldn't it?
Well, that would be a show of force. And I think the real problem is not that we would have trouble doing that. It's what the North Korean response would be, and anticipating retaliation against the South Korea. That's the biggest concern we've always had, and the president has to plan for that. I think that would mean before we do anything like that, he's going to have to order the departure of all dependent personnel from the military, from the State Department. Hasn't done that, hasn't issued a travel warning, hasn't really redeployed a lot of American forces to the region. So I think we're still a long way from that possibility.
But that would be a signal, wouldn't it? We start saying dependents
Look, we've got
leave.
to decide. Yeah, we've got to decide, are we going to live with a nuclear North Korea? Susan Rice and the Democrats are. I don't think we should.
Do we accommodate it or do we stop it? That's the question. And I think the left wants to accommodate. Mr. Trump wants to eliminate it and stop it. I think that's it. Mr. Ambassador, thanks, as always, for joining us, sir. John Bolton.
Thank you, Stuart.
All right, it's a pleasure to have my buddy John Bolton on with us. John, how are you, sir?
Glad to be with you, Mark. Always glad to do it.
All right. Decertify, not decertify, and then what? Tell the American people.
Well, you know, the only in Washington could you get wrapped around an axle like this, where the president's apparently about to conclude that the Iran nuclear deal is not in America's best interest, which is certainly correct. He's going to. His aides are recommending he not certify to that effect to Congress, and that's correct too. But they want him to stay in the deal. This is it's illogical, it's internally contradictory, it's really in some respects the worst of both worlds. The clean way to do this is not only not to certify under this Corker-Cardin legislation that the deal's not in our interest, but to do what he said in the campaign and get out of the deal entirely. That is a form of political and moral leadership that will make it clear to the rest of the world we do not accept that Iran will ever have deliverable nuclear weapons.
You know, Andy McCarthy writes today, he says, why do we continue to accept betrayal by the Iranians and act like that somehow this can be managed or somehow we can reform it? And you wrote your brilliant piece, same website, National Review Online, and you pointed out, you said, hey, look, there's a lot of things we can do to punish, in fact, bring down this regime. That doesn't require war. There's a lot of things that we can do, and we would have an enormous ability to do it if we got out of this deal.
Right. The idea that somehow staying in the deal kicks the decision over to Congress, I just think is unpresidential. And so you ask yourself, why would anybody come up with such a too cute by half ideas, don't say the deal's in America's national interest, but stay in the deal? I think it's because the deal supporters know how strongly the president feels about how bad the deal is. So they're trying to desperately find some way to stay in the deal, hope they can survive through the Trump administration, and then revive it. Look, the Iranians have never had any intention of giving up their pursuit of deliverable nuclear weapons. People talk about whether the deal's verifiable. You know, the Iranians in over 2 years now have never allowed the International Atomic Energy Agency to look at the military facilities where the design work on the bomb, the explosive work that's critical to detonating a nuclear weapon are taking place. The International Atomic Energy Agency is confined to investigating the sites that have already been declared, that are already publicly known. This is like a drunk looking for his keys under a light post because the light's clearer there. Of course the Iranians are not going to cheat in the full visible reign of the international inspectors. And we can only guess at what they're doing with North Korea. We know this. Iran is a rich country that wants nuclear weapons technology. North Korea is a poor country that has nuclear weapons technology. Is this hard to figure out what's happening?
You know, John, as I listen to you and as I read on this subject, What's amazing to me is Iran signed the deal because Iran knew even if they complied with every syllable of the deal, they would have nukes in 10 years.
Yeah, and they'll have nukes before that. Look, the deal was front-end loaded with benefits for Iran. Its responsibilities are all at the back end. But if the U.S. pulls out of this deal, we can still impose heavy economic burdens because they're not going to buy any U.S. products if the sanctions go back into effect. And they know that staying in the deal is good for them because their concessions on the nuclear program at the front end were trivial and easily reversible. The head of their program said a few weeks ago that if they pulled out of the deal, they could resume their uranium enrichment program at pre-deal levels in 5 days. So they didn't give up anything of significance.
What concerns me, though, and the administration is putting out its position to various reporters and so forth. I'm looking at my friend Eli Lake's piece today in Bloomberg. This kind of tells you where they're coming from, right? I mean, we're going to decertify, and then we're going to have all these, we're going to put all these pressures on Iran and on Iranian businesses, on our businesses and so forth, but they're not going to abrogate the deal. Is there anybody close to the president? Is there anybody in any of these departments at the top level who support pulling out of the deal?
I'm not aware of any. I tried to see the president to urge that position. I didn't make it. I've asked again today to see him. I don't know what will happen there. But honestly, if the president were really given the full picture, I can't imagine he would be prepared to say, I think this deal is harmful to the United States, but I'm going to stay in it. What possible logic is there? If you want to put pressure on Iran, get out of the deal. State your position clearly. As Paul Laxalt said back in the Reagan years to Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, urging him to resign, he said, cut and cut cleanly. We're not cutting cleanly here. We're taking a butter knife to this deal, and the Iranians will take full advantage of that.
And the Iranians, since this deal has been signed, have been giving enormous sums of money to Hezbollah, to Hamas, as it tries to further upset that region and focuses on Israel. It's toppled Yemen. It is working with the Syrian regime in order to kill allies of ours, and it is doing all these things, whether it's in this deal or not, which demonstrate their provocation and their desire to do what? To go to war, to expand their power, to expand terrorism and so forth. Is that another reason to get out of this deal?
Sure. Look, this is the way they're behaving before they have deliverable nuclear weapons. All the things that you just said. Imagine what their behavior will be once they get that capability. It was fundamental to Obama's logic that if only he could convince the Iranians that the oppressive United States didn't have a hostile intent toward the Ayatollah's regime, that they'd say, oh, well, in that case, we don't need nuclear weapons. You can say that's a naive view on Obama's part. You can say whatever you want about it. The Iranians took him to the cleaners. And Trump is absolutely right. I believe this is the worst diplomatic deal in American history. And the notion that the president is being advised to stay in it, it's just appalling. Look, we've had 3 straight administrations for 25 straight years have failed to deal with the Iranian nuclear weapons program effectively. By the way, failed to deal with the North Korean nuclear weapons program effectively either. And unfortunately, though, the bill will come due in the Trump administration when they will likely get that capability unless he stops it. And it's a hard road, but if you fail to get out of the nuclear deal entirely, if you don't break cleanly, if you get lost in the Washington bureaucracy, you're never going to be able to mount the kind of pressure on Iran that's necessary.
John Bolton, I appreciate it. Very, very well said. You take care of yourself, and we'll be right back.
Ladies and gentlemen, and the people of North Korea, please welcome Mr. Weird Al Yankovic.
Would you annihilate us if you had the chance? That's such an antisocial thing to do. You've got us crapping our collective pants. May I suggest you take it down a notch or two? We're not exactly sure why you're upset. Did that 'Cause if you got to know us, I bet we're mostly harmless, decent people. Hey, we're really not so bad. My point is, please don't nuke us, North Korea. Right now we're all a little tense. Believe me, we don't hate you, frankly. We don't even think that much about you, no offense. Now you might call us bloodthirsty dogs, but that metaphor's not very apt. We're just a bunch of simple fidget spinning goofy dorks who probably couldn't find your country on a map. No, we're not savages or cannibals. Well, maybe just a really, really, really small percent. So I think it would be best if you'd knock off those missile tests. Don't turn us into cinder while we're swiping right on Tinder. Don't jumpstart Armageddon or our beds will soon be wetting. Won't you think this through for a moment, please? Now why would you bomb our nice celebrities? Or why in the world would you kill Tom Hanks? 'Cause nobody doesn't like Tom Hanks. So